if we're talking about general decline in the quality of life, um, this has to do with a lot of factors. But if you're going to reduce it to, or if you're going to go find one big thing, is that um, Americans do not have government anymore. Um, so there's some entity that calls itself the government, but you can't really call it something when it doesn't do that thing at all. Okay, specifically, I mean, if you have a police officer and he doesn't police a community, is he really a police officer? If you have a so-called government and it doesn't govern, is it really a government? And this question is something that Mencius points out, and Confucians in general point out that a person who does not do the thing um, that their entitle indicates is not really that thing, right? So, for example, Mencius says, "I've never heard of a king being overthrown. All I know is this person is a thief and a tyrant." And so this king has simply executed a fellow person. So that's the idea there, right? So if you don't have government, um, your life is necessarily going to decline. And so what you can see with the government working is that, uh, or rather, if you look at what the government actually does, it is inflating the currency, which causes all sorts of problems, but it's also not governing in any kind of proactive sense. So, what does governing entail? It entails taking care of the culture. And that is something, by the way, I mean, a lot of this is just the background of this is that democracy, of course, is not real government. Okay, because democracy cannot correct the people. A primary responsibility of government is to actually change the culture for the better. Okay, and a democracy is essentially incapable of really doing that. Okay, because the best it could do is it could take the majority's moral sensibilities and impose it on the rest. Okay, so in that case, the majority of people already need to be moral. All right, and because things go towards entropy, not only in the world of physics, but also in the world of human behavior, because things go towards entropy, even if you start off with a majority of people having the right morality somehow, over time, that's going to be dissolute. That's going to dissolve into dissolution. Okay. So you have a dissolute populace, and then that lack of morality is what's going to be used to correct others. It doesn't work, right? Now you're also asking for this kind of time and place. Like, when did this all start? And it's tempting to say it started around 25 years ago. Okay, it started a quarter century ago in 2001 when this happened or that happened. It's tempting to do that because there tends to be a certain kind of event that you remember very traumatically, and then it's easy to use that as a dividing line between the good times and the bad times. But I was alive before and after those times, and the times before 2001 were not very good. The times after 2001 were worse, and every half decade is significantly worse. That's true. But it doesn't mean things were very good or there's some kind of discontinuity between before 2001 and after 2001, because that's not really how things work. So you have a population that never really had a real government to begin with. that really was kind of a way to extract money and power out of the population. It has always arguably been that way. Because I am actually a huge critic of the Constitution. I don't think the Constitution was really written for the common man's benefit. That's why the Bill of Rights are amendments. An amendment is a fix, right? It's an afterthought. So what's in the articles is the real Constitution, the original Constitution, the, what the Constitution is intended to put into effect. Okay. This basically is turning 13 different states that were actually independent that met in a Congress, much like countries do today in the United Nations. Okay, it takes that and turns those 13 different states into one singular imperial entity, from which it can act in unison. It can control a lot of money. It can control a lot of power, and therefore do things like expand all the way to the Pacific. Of course, it can also rival European empires. It can do all these things because it has now become unified into one polity, one entity that is capable of waging war, raising finances, and etc. Okay, and over time, that federal government becomes more powerful over the states, especially after the Civil War, right? So that becomes a very long story. Now, you might ask, like, why is it so bad all of a sudden? Why did the decline accelerate so fast? Because I think if you look at history, what you find is that America is very fortunate. Okay, and it's very fortunate in a number of ways. One is that it just has a lot of resources. I can't think of a land with better resources than what the United States has today. In terms of what's not just the raw size of it, but also the stuff you could take out of the ground, the different climates it has access to. If you look at Canada, it's much colder. Okay. If you look at China, um, it's not as, to my understanding at least, it's not as fertile, right? It doesn't have as much diversity of resources, right? That's why China does not really export oil, even though the USA can, right? There's no land that's better. And on top of that, it's surrounded by two giant oceans. So it's relatively untouched by so-called old world, aka Eurasian conflicts. Okay, so it's really isolated and protected by two giant oceans. Yeah, it was founded at a time where the rivals were really, really weak tribal entities. They were mostly nomadic. And so it was very easy using British technology and culture to push them away, to push them out and conquer their territory. So you have basically, since the Constitution, really, um, a century and a half of extremely good fortune. And then World War II finishes up, and everywhere else that could be a rival is in rubble, right? Because they were actually fighting the war. Okay, it's in complete disrepair. So, for the time being, the United States can call the shots. Okay, we have very completely intact factories. We have a robust population. Uh, the United States can produce as much as it, uh, you know, pleases, really. Okay, and it can invest in all these economies that are rebuilding itself, and it has almost unparalleled military might. Now, given all that, it shows you how dysfunctional the political order is. That within, let's say, the 50s to the 60s to the 70s. The 70s is the first real significant crisis. Okay, the 70s, right around it's Nixon who takes the United States off the gold standard with ramifications for the entire world. Okay, so already it's kind of an admitting that things are not really working so well. Okay, so you have this giant kick of the can down the road. There's a huge kick. you know. You might as well have, you know, I don't know, does it sound kind of a little like football, right? This kind of idea of really kicking it down the road, or as a kind of as kind of an attempt to make things work.
Like punting?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, isn't it kind of like punting, where um, you're
Playing
hoping
it
it'll work,
safe.
and it does,
Yeah,
right?
playing it safe. Yes. Like,
Yeah, it's kind of a safe way to do it, but it's also a way to like, um, I mean, it's a kind of a combination of the two, right? Kicking the can down the road, you deal with the problem later on, but also it's like a very safe way to advance, right? And so that's kind of two ways to look at it, right? But basically, by taking the USA off the gold standard, you just make it easier to be fiscally irresponsible, all right? Um, but at the same time, for the time being, you're putting yourself on more solid footing, okay? Because you had already overspent, and you find a basically way out of it, right? So that's the 70s. Okay. Then you have the fall of the Soviet Union, which is another opportunity for the USA. And then you go to the 90s, and then you finally get to the 21st century, and everything starts to fall apart because the whole political order is extremely corrupt. The culture is based on the wrong values, it's anti family values. And the government, which should lead, which should correct the culture, which should correct people on the basis of right and wrong, on justice, on righteousness, on morality, doesn't do any of it. It exists ostensibly, right? This is its explicit goal to ensure material prosperity. And it can't even do that. That very narrow, petty goal, that very narrow and petty goal, it cannot achieve. So when you have a really dysfunctional government, it can't really even be considered a government because it can't govern. You don't have a government anymore, right? So that's why, I mean, I think the term United States of America doesn't really make sense. We don't have states anymore, right? These 50 entities are not states. They're more like semi autonomous zones, right? Kind of like an HOA is to a city, or a city is to the county, or a county is to the state, right? You don't get full freedom. You have no ability to make fully your own laws. You have no ability to raise your own tariffs. You have no ability to, you know, contradict the federal, you know, um, constitutional laws. You don't have the ability to raise your own army, navy, etc. Okay, you have a semi-autonomous zone. That's what these things are. Okay, an HOA is to the city, a city is to the county, a county is to the state, a state is to the entity known as the USA. So you don't really have states anymore. And yet, if you look at who really runs your daily life, they're corporations. And the way that democracy works is that it's inherently plutocratic. So those corporations are really the kingmakers, right? The guys who control politics ultimately, right? And that's why over time you really have a selling out to the wealthy. Okay. So you have a plutocracy. Okay. The way that wealth is generally generated and exercised is through the corporation. And so that's really who's calling the shots. And they just care about their own money. They don't care about the common people's money. And they certainly don't care about the common people's morality, culture, and family life. So as long as there's a lot of money that could be generated, the common people can feast off of the many crumbs that fall. Right? They're an afterthought, but they're so overflowingly plenty that you can get that. But once the easy money runs out, once the low hanging fruit is all picked, once once the food gets consumed up more and more, what's left? Because the thing is, if you're an American, and if you lived in the West in general, your governments have never really cared about you. Okay, I can say that sort of for Americans. With regards to other countries like in Europe, the further back in time you go, yeah, you have a real government. Okay. But if you're looking at more like since you democratized, you have less and less of a real government. Okay? Because again, democracy is inherently plutocratic. Plutocracy is ruled de facto by the wealthy. Oligarchy is rule officially, legally by the wealthy, okay, on the basis of a property requirement. But plutocracy is messier and it is more chaotic and disorderly and confusing because it's not supposed to happen that way, but in practice it happens that way. And so it's really hard, if not impossible, to find who is accountable or to take people to account. It's impossible to find out who actually is responsible for this or that. Okay, so that's the problem you have. Okay, the money just ran out, right? Around the beginning of the 21st century, the money ran out. Okay, it's no longer easy anymore. The other countries of the world built up their economies. They have the same technology, if not better than the United States of America, the USA. They have all these things. They caught up. They rebuilt. They have something new. They can contend. And this inherently corrupt political order is not capable of any genuine leadership. And that's why we're finally facing what we have today, because these special resources are not so special anymore. Okay. And because of the corruption, the USA keeps getting involved in places that doesn't benefit the USA's common people. It just makes the wealthy wealthier, gives them an opportunity. And that's the thing about the people who make it to the top. You have to understand that these are ultimately merchants, and merchants are, what they consider first is their profit. And these are the guys who are the most powerful. So they're not going to care about you. And they're going to see an opportunity to make more money. They're going to take it, or they're going to instigate it. So all this should not be mysterious. This is all really an inevitable consequence of democracy. And you don't have a real government when you have this sort of system. Perhaps as things are getting bad, that's not helpful, right? Things get bad all the time and then they get better, right? So, and the same thing with the empire. Like, what is an empire? Is it just big and kind of mean? That's not really helpful. It's important to be able to define these terms, because once we identify as something, we can go ahead and figure out the nature of it, right? So, if I, identify something as, for example, a pencil, I know I could write with it, right? In other words, by identifying it, I can make use of it better, right? Okay, so when we're talking about these things, what is collapse? I mean, what do you think collapse is? How would you define it?
When I think of collapse, I think of like the complete fall of a quote unquote sovereign state or a government. So, like for example, earlier you mentioned the collapse of the Soviet Union, uh, or something even like where a revolution happens that could also be qualified as a collapse, maybe.
So inner definition is sort of this zeroing out, right? And I think that's not really a useful way to look at it, because I think that's actually pretty rare in history that something gets completely zeroed out, right? Um, so you could talk about overthrow, you could talk about being conquered, and those are words that would mean a zeroing out of the state. Okay, so the Qing dynasty, right? Is it conquered? Is it overthrown? Is it dissolved? Is it abdicated? Right? We have specific words for that. The USSR, right? They dissolved, right? But if we're talking about collapse, there's no such thing as it reaching zero. Like, in other words, there's no more buildings. There just aren't any buildings. Now, that's not true. Even the Roman Empire wouldn't have could be considered to have collapsed, right? Because they're still holding events like in the Colosseum and stuff, right? Those buildings are still standing and relatively operable. Okay. So collapse is not something that means it just disappears. Okay. I think collapse is um, an inability to become healthy again, an inability to become healthy again. That's what a collapse is. So once you decline, there might be still some hope, some realistic hope that you improve. But then you decline to a certain point where you know that improvement is not capable, or at least improvement enough is possible. It's impossible now. That to me is a collapse. An empire, there's different ways to describe empire. Okay. A lot of people think about something that is big territorially and powerful militarily and think that's what an empire is. But that doesn't really, I mean, those are pretty relative terms, right? So is the Roman Empire no longer an empire once it can't stop Attila the Hun? I don't think we could say that. Is the Athenian Empire not an empire because they never left the Greek peninsula, or at least, not far beyond it? No, I don't think that's valid either. So an empire, um, what it is, I think what we normally mean by empire um, is that this is a polity that is expansionist and is primarily driven by the pursuit of profit. And that's what causes it to want to or realistically need to expand. So the United States, the USA can be considered a empire of sorts in the sense that it is no longer, if ever really was, a polity that exists around a specific ethnicity. Okay, the way that, for example, Japan is today, right? Japan today isn't an empire because the people they govern is really just Japanese. Okay. Um, Whereas once you start to govern people who are not at all like you, whether ethnically or culturally or whatever, and that gets us to this kind of question: do Americans have a culture? Right? That's kind of a big question that always comes up from time to time. Do Americans have real culture? I would say there is a culture. It's just not coherent. It's incohesive, and it's not. There's no refinement in it. Okay, it's a very base culture, but it is still culture, right? I don't think culture can ever not exist in any place. There's always a culture. It might not be very pleasant though, right? So the United States, so look at all the different ethnicities, look at all the kind of the sort of very different cultures. That's not even um, delineated through geography, but more delineated through other aspects like rural versus urban versus suburban. Okay, so for example, the culture that exists in a city like Saratoga in California, okay, will be extremely different from Brooklyn in New York. Will be very different from a small town in Florida. Will be very different from a rural area in Idaho, right? These are, very different ways of life, not just in terms of like the buildings you enter into in and out, okay, but it's a very different way of life in terms of what's valued, how people talk to each other, you know. Um, and in a sense that itself is going away. Um, but the nature of the USA empire is that it's not even just within the people within its own territory, it's the amount of influence and power and control it exerts over its so-called allies. Okay. And so that was what makes the USA empire more of an empire than it already would be by simply sticking to the 50 so-called states. Okay. Um, so am I making sense so far here?
Hmm. Hmm. Yes.
So I think that when you start to look at collapse, I mean we already see a USA that's already collapsed. It is already collapsed. It cannot actually get better. It is not going to be healthy for a very, very, very long time. You can find pockets of healthiness here and there in the USA. You can find pockets of functionality there, here and there. But that's something you could say about lots of different places. There's almost always a place where you could, if you have enough money for that polity, live in that place that's relatively stable and functional, at least until the entire polity might be overthrown or conquered. Okay. You can always find those places and try to live there if you have the fortune to do so. But for the most part, what you can have access to will be dysfunctional. It will not be healthy enough. And the reason why it's dysfunctional or not healthy enough is because human needs cannot be met in most places in the USA. It cannot be met. So I always go back to human needs, right? Because people always lose track of these things. They're always talking about this or that, and they go off into strange areas. But if you're really thinking about what a human being needs, what you need, it's actually going to help you figure out what's a dysfunctional place and what isn't. What do you need? Well, you need to be able to meet a spouse, have children, raise those children in quietude and stability, raise them to know right and wrong and human nature, raise them to have wisdom, and then they should be able to relatively easily have spouses and repeat the same cycle again. And that's the key, because once you start to think about one generation, you have to think about many generations, because the sustainability of human life depends on its repeatability. So if you go move to somewhere, you might, for that generation, have enough money to afford your high priced condo, and then you have maybe one or two kids. But then what do they do for money? Can they still also get a job to pay enough so that they can do the same thing? No, they probably have to move somewhere else. But then why aren't you at the other place to begin with? Well, the same reasons that you avoided that other place that your children are going to move to is why your children should probably have to live in the same place that you are. Okay. In other words, the only way that you can make life work is by living in, say, the Bay Area. Okay. And then you have your kids, and they can't afford the Bay Area. They have to live in a place that's not like the Bay Area. Then they're in trouble, right? So it's not sustainable. It's not repeatable. And that's how you know this has collapsed. Because you don't have a political order that is capable of revitalizing or rectifying the people or the country or whatever you call the community. You don't have a political system that is capable of it. You're already at this point where your birth rates are plummeting. Every year, fewer people are having fewer and fewer children because it's too hard to get just a job. We have machines and electricity, and with fertilizer, we have everything we need to feed the population. And yet the population is just too stressed out to have children, too pessimistic to have children, too anxious, so anxious that their whole reproductive systems are shutting down, so tired and busy that they don't have time to conceive, time and energy to conceive. Okay, because you have also statistics that not only is the birth rate falling, people are having less sex. So the rates of intercourse itself is at an all-time low. Okay, even as people are getting more and more addicted to drugs, they're avoiding intercourse. And there's something truly dysfunctional about that, right? So you're at that stage Look at your political leaders. They are stupid people, except for one thing: getting elected, flattering the population, pulling the strings, going to make deals with the plutocrats, the wealthy people who will give them campaign money to win. That's what they're good at. That's their intellectual skill set. They don't know how to formulate policy. They don't know how to think about human nature. They don't know what right is or wrong is. They don't know how to help the common people live dignity. They don't they themselves have dignity. In fact, in order to win elections, you have to basically throw out your dignity. That's the system you have. And that's why it's actually hopeless. You can call this nihilistic. I'm not a nihilist. I actually believe that life has meaning. I believe that there are good things in life. What I believe, what I don't believe is that we have a political system that is capable of achieving that. And that's the thing that we always have to end up going back to, is to simply recognize that you cannot have a functional community with democracy. You cannot have that. I mean, I keep bringing this up again and again, but it really is true. It is too dysfunctional inherently of a system. And every ancient philosopher recognizes, anybody of any worth recognizes this. All right? Plato wrote about this. Socrates died making this case, being killed by the very same democracy that he knew was harming the Athenian people. Okay, if you look at the Confucian philosophers, right? Just look at the reality that they do not believe that the common people can make political decisions well. And just look at it from an economic standpoint. We're all too busy to keep up with what's really going on. We've never met these people face to face. All we know about these people is from very curated, polished media. All right? Whether it's pro or against them, whether it's in favor of them or against them, it's all very highly polished and selected. We don't know who these people are at all. We're familiar with their speaking patterns, which is why I can do a great Trump impression. Nobody does a better Trump impression than me, Donald Trump, right? That's easy to do because you hear them talk so much, but you don't really know who they are. So you don't know who these people are, and then it's more than just a president, right? It's all these elected officials. All these elected officials, and they're all blaming each other, why we couldn't get this thing done, why we couldn't accomplish this, why this bad thing happened. They're all pointing at fingers at each other, okay? And then the branches are going to point fingers at each other. So it's not just one congressman pointing fingers at the other congressman. It's the Congress pointing fingers at the president. That's the president pointing fingers at the Supreme Court pointing fingers at the Congress, right? Nobody can be held accountable under this system. It's always hot potato. We're passing on the buck, right? There's no accountability because that's the thing when you have the so-called checks and balances and you set it up this particular way, it doesn't actually work. You know what really works? The Rus system, the Confucian system. That one actually works. That one has a censorate, right? You have a king, you have a prime minister, right? It's very clear when somebody messes up. And there are ways to simply identify and recognize it, and therefore make the right actions. But this whole other thing is too diffuse, and there's just no way to pin down who's accountable. And it's just a complete mess. And here's the last thing. The Constitution is the one thing that holds America all together because nobody has anything in common. Nobody has anything in common, okay? It's not even like the majority of people are one religion. And even with that one religion that would be the closest, Christianity, it's all broken up into smaller pieces. I mean, there's like a liberal version of Christianity. There's a conservative version of Christianity that's not even getting into the denominations. So religion isn't holding the USA together. Ethnicity isn't holding the USA together. The culture changes every 5, 10 years because the culture is essentially controlled by the corporation who wants to sell you more things by changing the culture. And that's why, the references that I have aren't even understood by somebody 10, 20 years younger than I am because they grew up with different shows that they watch. So I can't even use that, right? And then this sort of thing just keeps deteriorating, right? Even the family is what's called the nuclear family, right? Husband, wife, children. Even that's decaying. So there is no unity. There is no cohesion. There is no harmony. The only thing that's keeping the whole USA together is the Constitution. But if that's the very same thing that causes dissolution, that causes the degeneracy, that causes disorder, that causes chaos, that causes corruption, then once the money runs out, once the fortune runs out, it's just completely downhill from here. So if you look at what collapses, America has already collapsed. If we look at empire, okay, there's not really a way for the USA to continue to grow because it simply doesn't have the raw power left for it. We were thinking about the economic aspect of the empire, right, which is the primary way that the USA conducts empire. Okay, but it's kind of built off of two things: one, a robust economy, and two, the petrodollar. Okay, and I don't want to get into the petrodollar too much, but basically, if you can get the entire globe to use your currency, that's very helpful for you because then you can print out more, and then that inflation can be absorbed by the rest of the world rather than your own people. The issue is, one, there's a movement away from using the dollar. Okay, and then two, the whole economy has gone into AI. But the problem is AI doesn't really work and it will never really work. And it won't work cost effectively, definitely, but it just on a philosophical level can't work. And that's a whole discussion for another time. And because the whole economy is geared towards this, when it finally pops, when it finally doesn't deliver what it's promising to deliver, America will have nothing really left. Okay, because its political order is so bad, it's going to be a very long time before it can ever establish anything close to the post World War II empire that it did. So empires are slow to go out because the people at top who have always been exploiting the common people and willing to exploit others, they're just going to drain even more and more as they can to withhold their power and their wealth at the top. So that's going to be dying kind of slowly. But from the common man's perspective, right, the common citizen, whatever you want to call him, it's already collapsed. It's over. And these guys at the top do not care about you, and they will never truly care about you. Maybe in some kind of really abstracted way, you know, like they want to have some kind of legacy. But do they really care about you? No, they do not. You know, they don't care about you any more than hearing louder applause. So I think that should more or less answer your concerns or your questions about empire and collapse, right?
Mhm. Yeah,
Do you have any
yeah.
other questions here?
Not really. Do you maybe like do you know what could be coming next or afterwards? Or like what
Um,
could replace the
yeah,
US?
there's a movement towards reinstituting the draft, which is going to be a really foolish thing to do because um, the population itself is extremely unhealthy. And also, there's probably not really a true need to wage um, this sort of land war. It's not really going to be effective. I think probably the notion of drafting is a lot of vainglory. It's just something to make the USA look more powerful than it really is on the global stage. Um, I don't think it really has to do with any kind of sensible or logical strategy. But then, arguably, the Iranian war isn't about that either. So it's a little hard to say. It's a very dangerous and unpredictable situation. I think that there is actually not much benefit to trying to predict how chaos will unfold because by its very nature, disorder creates chaos, and chaos itself is unpredictable by nature, right? If it were predictable, there would be a kind of pattern to it. And because there's a kind of pattern to it, there is a kind of order to it. It might be an evil or perverse order, but it's an order nonetheless, right? If somebody goes to gamble, right? I mean, the order is not for moral purposes, but there's still an order to it, right? You know to come in, you can exchange money for chips, you go to a certain table, you know where to place your bets, and you know what happens if certain cards come up, right? That's order, but that's not chaos, right? It's order. It might be unrighteous order, right? But there is a kind of order. It is not. Uh, it's moral chaos. That's true, but it's not physical chaos, right? Because I think your question gets at physical chaos.
I guess so.
Um, what's that?
Yeah, yeah, more like physical chaos.
Okay. So the so when we go back to the polity as a whole, right? What we have is a lot of chaos um, as a whole, right? And so we don't really know where this is all going to lead. Again, democracy is a very scary thing, right? Because kings actually um, they have an incentive. They actually do have an incentive that their polity is at least stable. Why? They are the most high status and wealthy person in that country. So if their whole country is unstable, it's like being the owner of a company and the company itself is unstable. You don't want that to happen. You don't want that to happen because that's your entire wealth right there, right? So kings actually have, at bare minimum, a correct incentive, a good incentive. Okay. And the reality is most kings are fatherly in nature. They actually do take seriously their obligation to take care of the people morally and culturally. Okay. They actually do have affection for their people. Okay. That's why kings have always been compared to fathers, because it's a natural kind of affection that they would have, particularly in mono-ethnic kingdoms. Okay. Once you get diverse, it gets a little harder, but they still have that kind of, uh, largely speaking, they have that kind of sensibility, right? Sometimes you do get a tyrant and so forth, and that's its own thing. But that's typically very uncommon through history, rare even. Okay, um, usually your kings are fatherly. Okay, and so even though they might not be the smartest guy, maybe they're a little lazy, they at least want to have a stable kingdom. Okay, they want to have a stable kingdom because they have to pass this on to their kids and their grandchildren and so forth. Now, if you are in a democracy, you don't pass anything on to anybody except for means of wealth. So your goal is to get a bunch of wealth and then pass that on to your children. And you don't really raise in the culture of a democracy and plutocracy is that virtue takes a very big back seat. So you might pass on wealth to your children, but they might just waste it because you didn't know how to raise them virtuously or even fiscally responsibly. Okay, so even in that case, they don't even have as much of an incentive to make a lot of money and pass it on to their children because they don't know if their children will be benevolent or even simply fiscally responsible with that inheritance. Okay, and if you look at Plato, democracy is a cause of family strife anyway, where he says fathers fear and flatter sons, more or less. I think I got the exact words maybe a little off, but there's a conflict, right? And so because of that distrust, and Shunzo also brings this up too, right? He talks about in chaotic times, there's distrust between father and son, right? So in that case, the inheritance mechanism isn't even itself a a very good incentive. So what happens in a democracy? People just exploit it during their lifetime, and they're not thinking about the future. Okay, that invites instability, that invites aggressiveness, that invites greed. That's why democracies have a tendency to expand imperialistically compared to kingdoms. Okay, because of that dynamic. So republics are the ones who actually establish large expansionist empires. Okay, monarchies tend to not do that.